you really don't need any introduction, but Danny is the Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. And before taking on that responsibility, is an extremely distinguished career in the American Foreign Service, most recently, was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. So, Danny, without further ado, views from the US, next step for the Biden administration on Asia. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jesper. Thanks to all of you, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be the first speaker, first foreign guest of the season for Asia Society Tokyo Center. You have nowhere to go but up. So thinking about the next steps for the Biden administration is a little bit like predicting the future, and we all know the great Yogi Berra quote, predictions are difficult, especially when they're about the future. So I'm not going to make predictions, but I would like to take a look at some of the factors that are shaping the policies of the Biden administration and that offer some clues about where that team is going on Indo-Pacific related issues. So I'll start with 6 factors that I think really set the stage. Obviously, the place to begin is the pandemic. And the fact that this is a moment of extraordinary global stress that has an impact on not just politics and policy, foreign policy, economic priorities, but really sort of the way we work, the way we interact. And it's clearly going to be a long-lasting impact. So this is one powerful shaping force here. Second, I would point to the team that Biden has assembled and the point that they all came into office with a tremendous amount of experience in foreign policy in Asia. None of these people need to be persuaded that the Indo-Pacific matters to the United States in terms of our security future, our economic prospects, and so on. This is a group that gets it. And remember, Biden is, maybe with the exception of Lyndon Johnson, as a legislator, the most experienced president the United States has ever had, steeped in foreign policy, and someone who knows Xi Jinping quite well. And I can attest to that personally because I was in all of Biden's meetings with Xi Jinping over the years, starting from 2011. So that level of experience on Biden's part, on the team's part, is not in any way a guarantee of success. But it does mean that they're not going to be making rookie mistakes, that this is not their first rodeo. And that's, take it from me, because I've worked through numerous transitions in US government, that's a big head start. These are true believers, people who believe there needs to be an active US role in economic terms, in diplomatic terms, in political terms, in security terms in the broad Indo-Pacific region. Third factor I would cite is the Trump hangover. The effect of the last 4 years on America's standing and on the perception of the United States by countries and partners in the region. So if Biden's campaign slogan was "Build Back Better," he's got to build back America's reputation and credibility and bring it to a better place, which is not easy. The polling showed a catastrophic drop in confidence in the United States on a number of levels among foreign audiences, among the publics. So confidence in the U.S. leadership is an intangible asset that it takes a long time to accumulate, and once dissipated, is very hard to recover. I think what this has contributed to, by way of a shift in the climate in the Asia-Pacific region, is a real spike in hedging. That countries and governments includingly view the United States with a certain degree of skepticism about our staying power and our credibility, at the same time that they're regarding China with a great deal of suspicion and concern based on the behaviors that they're seeing. So this is an uphill battle for Biden and the Biden team to win back trust, to mend fences. And the emphasis that Biden places on values, for example, which can be a complicating factor, sort of is an indicator of the extent to which international confidence that America stands for something bigger than self-interest was really shaken. And you add to that the shredding of treaties, the dissing of allies as freeloaders, not to mention the insurrection on January 6th and political polarization. This is a tough fight to wage. And you see Biden rejoining international organizations, pursuing climate change initiatives and groupings, holding the Quad Summit, holding Leaders Summit, and so on, in an effort to try to demonstrate American renewed commitment to values, to human rights, commitment to allies, to treaty obligations. And as I said, this is a bit of a three-dimensional chess game in that the emphasis on values, for example, is quite discomforting to many of the governments in the region, governments that the U.S. needs to deal with. The investment in the Quad is also quite discomforting, not just to China, but to ASEAN, which is wary about having sort of a competing geopolitical center of gravity. So none of this is easy. So I mentioned China, and I think my fourth factor, and one of the biggest ones, has got to be the transformation in China's direction in the policies and in the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party over the last half dozen or so years. At home, much more ideological, much more nationalistic, party control over all aspects of society, and a real tightening of the leash on private entrepreneurs and the private business sector in China, as we see, plus the championing of state-owned enterprises and so on, which raises real questions about reconciling the Chinese economic system with the broader international system, and certainly with things like the CPTPP. Internationally, what we're seeing is a new emphasis on out-and-out coercion. We see it in the Senkakus, in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Straits. We see it in the leveraging of China's market access, both as a carrot, but troublingly as a stick. Look no further than H&M or the NBA or Australia to see, what a blunt instrument that can be. So it's a vastly more assertive set of policies and behaviors, also a much more competitive posture globally. I think, fifth, I'd flag that Chinese attitudes towards the United States are an important ingredient, and I would sum those up as a mix of anger and suspicion. I see real contempt for the United States growing, a perception of the United States as a spiteful, sore loser, a declining power that is hell-bent on hurting China's legitimate interests, in blocking China's rightful place, its peaceful development. Looking at the Quad, looking at alliances as a 20th century anachronism, an anti-China bloc, looking at the international system as rigged in favor of the U.S. and the West in an unfair way. And the growing confidence, some would say arrogance, is embodied in this conviction that the correlation of forces has reached a point that China's time has come, America's time has passed, the East is rising, the West is fading, and so on. And next, I'd flag U.S. attitudes towards China, which I would also describe basically as a combination of anger and suspicion. And not just from the political elites, not just from the general public, but from the business community increasingly, the people who have for decades been the sort of the heavy weight-bearing columns in the U.S.-China relationship. People are angry about the way that their employees, their businesses are treated by the Chinese. And people in the U.S. are repulsed at the way that the Chinese Communist Party is treating its own minorities and dealing with its neighbors. And what I see is that the past principles for managing the relationship, commitment to engagement, cooperation, acceptance, and embrace of interdependence, man, these things are like obsolete now. They're dirty words. And that means that for the Biden team, there is much less room for compromise, much less room for maneuver when it comes to China policy. So next, you notice, Jesper, at the beginning, I didn't promise to be brief. I want to ask ourselves, we should ask ourselves sort of what do we know about the Biden team's approach to Asia? And here I'd flag 4 points. One, the determination, readily expressed by Biden to concentrate on domestic recovery, domestic renewal. This is a critically important factor in sort of gauging the trajectory of the Biden administration's approach to Asia, but it does not mean that they are so consumed with domestic affairs that they can't get to foreign policy. It does not mean that, in part because they've emphasized that foreign policy and domestic policy have to be complementary, have to be part of an integrated strategy and mutually reinforcing. Related to that is that Joe Biden is a guy who knows a thing or two about authoritarian Leninist systems. He spent a lot of his life dealing with Soviet bloc governments and so on, and he gets what I think is the critical factor in Leninism, which is that it's all about power. And that unless and until the Chinese perception of the United States is that America is getting its mojo back, that it's proving its resilience, trying to engage constructively and get improvements in Chinese behavior, trying to negotiate with China is going to be rolling a big rock uphill. And it's going to come crashing back down on you. Now, being tough, being strong, dealing from a position of strength, which is something that Biden talks about, that's not to be confused with the chest thumping, I'm going to kick your butt kind of bravado that we have heard in the past. It's really about proving America's resilience. It's about bouncing back. Second attribute of the Biden team that I'd flag is the priority that they place on consultation. This is not just lip service. And I know personally, for a fact, that on big projects like the North Korea policy review that they embarked on immediately, like the China review that's still underway, one of the early steps, and I know this from talking to my friends in the Gaiman show, was to come to partners like Japan and ask, what do you think? Here's how we see the challenge. Here are some of the options. We want your input, so that Japan, Australia, UK, other partners' input can be part of the equation of policymaking and of decision making. that's consultation. It ain't consultation if you already made the decision. That's like with us or against us, you know, grabbing the other guy by the collar and dragging him along with you. And that chorus of voices, not arm twisting, but inclusivity, is, and the network of allies and partners and like-mindeds who feel we've got a common interest in a common project, that's been an incredible force multiplier for the United States in post-war history. And I think Biden is determined to resurrect that. Now, in the best of times, coordinating with partners ain't easy. And these ain't the best of times. So it's a very difficult project. China, for example, is a huge market for every single government that we deal with. And the Chinese, as I mentioned, are not hesitating to throw their weight around to punish those who align with the US, to discourage those who may be wavering. That makes it difficult. I think the early summits that Biden had with Suga, with Moon, these are very important. I think the Quad summit that he held was very encouraging, in part because it wasn't about China. And it wasn't even about the self-interest of the four countries. It was about doing things that really matter for the region. Vaccines to Southeast Asia, help with emerging tech to the developing countries. Focusing on benefit, real benefit to the region, I certainly think is the way to go. Third attribute is the emphasis on rules, a rule-based order, on values, on an approach to foreign policy that's grounded in international law and international norms. That means caring and working on democratic governance, on active multilateralism, protecting rights, civil rights, legal rights, human rights, and so on. And that's why, for example, the Biden administration took a strong stance against the coup in Myanmar. That commitment to human rights means more than just banging on China. It can't be exclusively China-focused to be credible. It means working across the region on promoting good governance, anti-corruption, women's rights, gay and LGBT rights, religious rights, press freedoms, sustainable development, promoting civil society, that kind of stuff. It means restoring a U.S. role and leadership role in institutions, working with partners, including especially Japan, to enforce international law. Fourth and last, China. I think a strategy for dealing with China was always going to be at the heart of any U.S. administration's approach to Asia. It just can't be the totality of the administration's approach to Asia. And Biden is clearly subordinating China policy to the broader objective in the Indo-Pacific. I know these people, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Kirk Campbell. This is a team that wants to be smart, careful, methodical, coherent, integrated in its approach to avoid self-inflicted wounds. And they're conducting a very careful review of the inheritance from the Trump administration, the various policies, tariffs, sanctions, and so on, to figure out not only what's what, not only what they want to keep, but also to figure out what would be involved in unwinding some of these measures. You don't just give away leverage in business or in international politics. You got to trade it for something. You got to negotiate it, and before you negotiate, you got to figure out what you want and what your strategy is, and that's what they're engaged in doing. They're not in a big hurry, then they're not rushing into the kind of formal, cumbersome, pomp and circumstance-laden institutional dialogues that the Chinese are very fond of. You hear a lot about three buckets in U.S.-China relations: the compete, contest, cooperate, or whatever C's people choose. It is possible to do all of these at the same time, believe it or not, and I know because I've seen it done, but it's not easy. And it's particularly not easy in this environment. I think the emphasis on competition is a little misleading, in part because Biden is not out to compete with China. He is out to out-compete China. This is a tough guy. And he's determined to outcompete, that the US should outcompete China in terms of technology in particular, securing what's been a historic US edge in tech and innovation. And that's both the defensive side of the equation, protecting intellectual property, but it's also the proactive side of the equation, which is creating intellectual property. And you see that in this $1.7 trillion infrastructure bill that he's trying to get through Congress. It's not about blocking China, it's about upping our game. And you do that through investments in R&D, education, worker upskilling, and so on. So, Jesper, I have not made a prediction for the future. Everybody here is going to want their money back when I say this, but I think the answer to the title question, what to expect, is it depends. It depends on whether Biden can get Congress to act on his legislation. It depends on whether political and social polarization in the US can subside. It depends on whether the economic recovery in the West is going to be fast enough to restore some balance with the PRC. It depends on whether Japan and Australia and others, including, GASP, South Korea, can, join hands and work in tandem. Can we deliver on vaccines and public health through the Quad? Can the US and China avoid an incident between our two militaries that escalates into an uncontrolled conflict? Will Xi Jinping be elevated at the 20th Party Congress? And once that happens, will the assertiveness increase or will it subside? Will Japan stay on a stable political activist trajectory like we saw under Abe, or revert to a revolving door era? Will the US and China compete the way that Olympic athletes compete, or will they compete the way that rival gangs compete? So these are some of the clues that I think we need to be watching for. And you can have me back after the 2022 midterm elections in the US and see where we are.
Danny, thank you very, very much. I think it's been very thoughtful, and I think you've given us a lot of, not just food for thought, but also a logic in terms of, what to focus on and what to look at. And certainly, I don't think I speak just for myself. It's fantastically good news to hear that America is back in the game, that America under the Biden administration wants to actually start with the home improvement, because if you're not strong, I'm sort of reminded of, under the Meiji Restoration, remember Fukukyohei, right? Strong country, strong army. I mean, you've got to show that you're actually the better system in terms of mobilizing resources, mobilizing innovation. But I am going to put you on the spot for 30 seconds. This renewed focus on values, right, rather than this sort of Trumpian everything goes. Very welcome in my personal view. We've seen China, as it were, swallow up Hong Kong over the last couple of years. Taiwan is on the agenda. I am going to force you to not necessarily make a prediction, but to give us some guiding points, for us as business people, as investors here in Japan, for the Japan-specific tensions. What are some of the tripwires that we should look out for in terms of an improvement for the better or an improvement for the worst?
Great question. Well, the The proximate flashpoint when it comes to Japan is the Senkakus. And the anomaly in the Senkaku situation is the fact that the United States does not take a position on the sovereignty of these features, but accepts that Japan has the administrative control of the islands. And that's important because under the US-Japan Defense Treaty, administrative control is the deciding factor for whether the United States has an obligation to come to the mutual aid if attacked. What China is trying to do is to undermine Japan's administrative control and prove that it doesn't actually control the Senkakus in an effort to obviate the security guarantee under the treaty. So it's not just harassment when you see this constant and increasing tempo of incursions. It's also a very, very real risk because both between Tokyo and Beijing and between Washington and Beijing, the mechanisms do not now exist to halt an escalation that could follow an incident. So an incident at sea or in the air, and Lord knows we've seen them before. 2001, Chinese jet intercepted a U.S. surveillance plane, the EP-3, and created a tremendous problem. That kind of incident will become a crisis, and that kind of a crisis, in the absence of these mechanisms, could really lead to tragedy. So how the US, Japan, and the Chinese begin the process of decelerating, of de-escalating, of reducing risk in the Senkakus is, I think, going to be one of the big bellwethers of the ability in the period ahead to find some modus vivendi that maintains a manageable level of risk.